Hello and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who, as the right man in the wrong place, can make all the difference in the world.
Oh, jeez. Tim Longo.
Hey, buddy, how you doing? I guess that makes me the G-Man or something.
Oh, that definitely makes you of the two of us. You are, the manipulative bastard.
Nice. That's nice. Nice talk. Nice talk in front of the children.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. That was an excellent one.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, man.
Well, we dove into Half-Life 2 this past time because we felt like we couldn't really walk away without at least talking a little bit more about Half-Life and kind of where it went.
Yeah.
And certainly talking to Marc and Dario, wet our whistle for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we were talking to them about Half-Life 1, it was unavoidable that they would bring up Half-Life 2 and a couple things, so just like we did with Last Guardian, I think, just kind of round out the set. Someday maybe we'll, play Half-Life 3 for the podcast.
Someday maybe. I think Halo Life 3 is just as likely.
Halo Life 3, that was classic. We'll be referencing that for years on the podcast.
Anyway, so let's get down to brass tacks. We played about, 2.5 hours, something along those lines. We played up to what was called Water
Hazard.
Hazard.
Once that title came up, it's the second title once you have the airboat, but kind of just the beginning after the first gate. So we didn't really, just a little bit of airboat stuff, but
right. Yeah, I remember the airboat, and although I was really keen on the idea of the airboat at the time, I found in practice it was fairly frustrating to control with the keyboard, just because it's digital inputs and analog motion. It was not my favorite part of the game, so I think leaving it there was perfectly fine for me. It's not a super long part or anything like that. It's just there are jumps and things you have to line up, and I can't be bothered in my old age. So, let's jump into kind of the beginning of it. Go. You're about to say.
I mean, your intro was a perfect intro for that because, I don't know. I think you referenced it when we were early in the Half-Life series of podcast. I think we both somehow got into the E3 demo up in the hotel room that they were doing for Half-Life 2 back in the day. Maybe the year before.
Did you not?
Oh, you didn't. Okay, so Daron got me into that somehow.
I think we would have been there, though. We would have been there for Republic Commando.
It was, yeah. It was Republic. We were showing off Republic Commando, so it was 2004.
Yes.
Yes.
That son of a gun.
I think we
didn't get me.
I think we were looking for you.
He was off my Christmas card list.
No, we were looking for a couple people, but we didn't find them because it was like one of those, the window's closing, we have to go now. It was super secret and super ridiculous.
And I didn't have a cell phone back then.
Right, nobody did, and we went to the, it was like it was in the W or some hotel room, and they weren't on the floor or anything, and I got the feeling that it was mainly developers they were showing it to. I'm not, maybe for tech demo reasons, but they were showing off FaceTech.
License the engine and
the reason I'm bringing it up is that most of the demo was it showed off Half-Life 2 early on, but most of it was really focused on their FaceTech.
Yes,
and
I remember that part of it well. Yes,
and Half-Life 2 opens with like a kind of a bold choice to start on the details of a face, which at that time, faces are not game development strong suit, like it's pretty bold,
yes.
To kind of do that. And then, at the time, I'd say they pulled it off. And then this character that you had quite a bit of mystery from the first one and really wondered what the heck he was all about. And then the way the first one ended, as we discussed in previous episodes, very interesting and intriguing opening in that regard. And they kind of just glossed over the fact of, he has a couple lines about it's your time has come again or something like that. They don't, and I think we talked about this on one of the episodes, but like, you know, they just gloss over what's been going on since Half-Life 1.
Yes, right. We did talk about that. They basically just dump you in to a new setting, and the bridge is the G-Man. Yeah, and in fact, the secondary part of that bridge is that they then load you right into a train as well. So they kind of immediately make it feel somewhat familiar. Mm-hmm. And
there's nostalgia and reminiscence.
Right. And you have that connecting character as well. So you know, because he's basically the last thing you see in the first game. So
interesting.
It is almost like you've just woken up from whatever happened then. Yeah. Who knows, you know, so.
Yeah, I forget. I don't have time to check on it, but somebody might have tweeted both of us. But one of the listeners mentioned, you know, that it would make an intriguing game to find out what happened between the two of them, two games, because there's some, you know, there's that mystery there. But one of the great insights that Marc brought up from his perspective on Half-Life 2 that never dawned on me until he mentioned it, and now replaying the opening 2 hours really hit home, is as they were trying to find that sort of hook or that grounded concept that really bridged the two games. But also, if you're not, as he said, in the first one, it was all about Black Mesa and about the installation, and everything revolved around that, right? Like get out, right? Get out of the base and all that stuff.
Get out or get through.
So every level, every area was based on something around the Black Mesa. In this, it was going to go across, you know, various places, right? You're going to travel, and so what's the connective tissue? But very immediately, the cast of characters and the scientists became that connective tissue, even to the point where I forgot that the bad guy is one of the other scientists from...
Yes. Supposedly. I don't remember his name coming up in the first one, but I can believe I missed it. I mean,
I don't remember that they actually said Dr. Breen, but if you look at the modern models, facial models of each of the scientists, you could correlate them with. But it's just hilarious to me that I mean, in the first game is very light, right? Like, they were characters, but they were not characters. You know, they didn't.
Well, and there was more than one of each model, and
But that they made so much out of these few characters in the second one, where they really do have characters, and the voice acting obviously is one of the keys, because it felt very familiar, right? When you met each of them one by one, and with Breen specifically, because of the video monitors up top, in the lines of City 17, which we should talk about in a second. It's just like very mysterious and ominous to see him up there and wonder what is going on, you know.
Yes, I mean it's really one of my favorite. It might be my favorite game opening.
Yeah, it's pretty good
for a lot of reasons. I mean, one is the establishment of setting so quickly and cleanly. You know everything you need to know basically about this setting. You know, certainly you have some Half-Life reminiscences. There we go. Third time's a charm. But you didn't know, you know, there was no Combine. There was,
you know, things right.
Yes. And so you're diving in. I'm laughing at myself right now because there's something that's been pointed out in email that we'll read later, and the person who wrote it is probably already laughing.
Oh, okay.
You'll hear later.
Okay.
Anyway, you get so much so fast, and so much of it is fairly subtle.
Yep. And you're not fighting. You don't fire a gun or even get.
There's tons of tension.
Oh yeah, it's really wonderful, and the way that you're interacting with the NPCs and the Combine themselves and the rule sets set up there, and really fully, again, one of my favorite revelations of probably this whole podcast so far, you know, as we kind of talk about our favorite moments from time to time, is just Marc talking about the fact that the commitment to first person was almost a production concern more than a creative concern, but to carry that forward. Obviously, in retrospect for them, once Half-Life 1 came out, everyone just gushed about that decision. They're, of course, going to commit to it in the second one. And they just go to the hilt, right? To the degree where, you know, that there's that one section where there's these guys and maybe one lady standing in line getting their food from a dispenser. Do you remember that section? And they're standing in line. Right, it's in still. You haven't even left the gated area yet. It's pretty early on.
I might have gone. If you can go around two ways, I might have gone around the other way.
So it goes. They stand in line, and then they pick up their like, organic
protein,
food,
Soylent Green.
Yeah, exactly, organic food product from the dispenser, and then they walk away. Right, and the line gets shorter and shorter. So I stood in line.
Did you really?
Waited. I did. Yeah, I waited till it came my turn to stand up to to stand next to the dispenser, and someone actually got in behind me and waited. And I turned and I didn't see him. I turned around. I was like, "Oh my god, there's a guy there standing and waiting for me." The unfortunate thing is, I waited a long time and nothing ever came out, so I didn't actually get to pick my dispenser. But the fact that worked. And that somebody stood behind me, like amazing. The attention to detail is just freaking crazy. And then I definitely made that special note that there's no conflict. You're not firing, you're not in combat for a long, long time. In these days, that was unheard of, right? Even for Half-Life 2, which was 2004?
4. Or maybe early 5. It was right around then.
Yeah,
I noticed because it was right when I moved to Maryland that people were starting to play it. So I think it might have been at the very beginning of 2005. Probably should have looked that up.
Oh, no. I think it was 2004.
Right. It might have been at the very end.
I remember watching Carl play.
It was, in fact, November 16th, 2004. You're right.
Before I left. Yeah. Because I left at the end of 2004.
Oh, right. Carl
Carl Wattenberg.
Wattenberg. That's right.
Yeah. Obsessed with this game, yeah. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to quickly mention, especially about the opening and the sense of place, again, to your point and to what we talked about in the previous episodes, just the harsh commitment to sense of place, right? The City 17 is just really well defined. I did want to mention, though, obviously we know Valve is a very collaborative team effort and everyone's really involved, but they did hire Viktor Antonov, who was unofficially, I guess you could say, kind of an art direction influence on Half-Life 2 specifically, right? And so the Combine's design
later for Dishonored and Dishonored 2.
Right, yeah, and he moved over to Arkane eventually. Yes. So, but I don't think, like, I don't want to, obviously because it's Valve, I don't want to give too much credit to one person's vision, but I do think the Combine designs, the ship designs, the Striders, like all of that stuff, really, I think the feel and look and sense of cohesiveness that Half-Life 2 specifically has is a lot due to his style, I think.
Yes, I mean, while we're talking about that, one of the things I really appreciate that, and actually thinking about it being also the person behind Arkane's design makes some sense, but the difference between, humans and Combine is the humans have faces.
Mm-hmm.
The Combine have masks. So there's this definite, immediate distinction between, enemy and friend, and oppressor and oppressed. You can't even know the oppressor, right? It has no face.
Mm-hmm.
And you see some of that happen later with, masked characters and things like that in Dishonored. Yes, I mean, there's a masquerade ball, for example, but I feel like there's also some other kind of mask in that. It's been a while since I played Dishonored.
Well, the cover of the box is...
Oh, right. Of course, you're the masked one in Dishonored. Yeah, right. So you kind of go behind the mask, but that's like to hide your identity, I suppose. Other things that I thought, as far as that goes, it gets right into characterizing these things immediately. You've got the downtrodden.
Yeah,
they're all sitting. They're kind of going around muttering to themselves. They have no real direction or agency, and these Combine are just kind of pointing them where to go, and they in fact point you where to go, and then you start going that way, and they stop you, and they make you go a different direction, and it's very much like, I have no power here. It's reinforcing that fact that you hold no gun. You can't do anything right now except follow directions.
And especially because it's interactive, that feels even
more oppressive. Yes,
yeah, it's really
and you get to a point later, and we'll talk about Barney in a minute, I suppose. But you get to a point later where they reinforce again your powerlessness in sort of a tutorial moment of you have to go, and this Combine soldier orders you to pick up a soda can. Pick up this trash and put it in this trash bin. And nowadays you get an achievement for that. I don't think that happened at the time, but he laughs and kind of, enjoys the power he has over you. So
but it teaches you can pick up everything. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that was probably one of the major revelations of this game is how much physics there is. That was another part of the hype that built up to this game. The faces were one thing, and I'd like to get right back to that in a second with Barney because he's the first face you see that's familiar in any case. And then you see more of those as time goes on. And of course, the G-Man. I guess I shouldn't.
Well, and Alex, right?
And then ultimately Alex, right?
Yeah, she's held up.
We'll talk. I want to talk about like each of these introductions. We've already talked about the G-Man.
Yeah.
But where was I going with that? I don't know now.
Sorry, I interrupted. With Barney, you mean, or with?
Well, yeah. Let's go back to Barney. Yeah, I think I've kind of milked the oppression for what we've got there. But
the last thing mini note I wrote down for that I don't know. Maybe when it had come out, I somehow hadn't read 1984 yet. And I got to that book late, and I read it maybe.
Clearly.
Yeah. No, I'm a late bloomer with that kind of stuff. But I read it probably 8 years ago or 10 years ago or something. So it was afterwards. But man, when you're running through the apartments and stuff, and there's the TVs on, with Breen on everybody's TV. Like it is, and everyone's in a blue suit. Like it is super 1984. Like
there's a lot to that. Yeah, I agree. It's sort of the proles, I guess. I think are what they're called, right?
Yeah, they might.
It's more. Yeah, they might deliberately be meant to be the proles. Because there is no like hate minute. For example, there isn't
not in every way, but like the general concept.
Definitely you see that like there's one completely powerful force and one completely underpowered force, and the whims of that powerful force are destructive in every way. Oh, we're just gonna. There's a conversation you pass by where they say, well, today they do the building, tomorrow they do the neighborhood, where they're looking for somebody in a building, kicking down doors. You end up going up and into those buildings.
Well, they're looking for you. They end up.
Yes,
I think that's what's going on there.
I don't know that's.
Well, eventually, throughout
eventually they're looking at you for certain. Yes.
I don't know. Yeah.
At that point, I'm not sure if it's meant to be that they're looking for you or if it's just more depiction of the environment.
Because
where you are.
But anyway, go talk about Barney real quick.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a couple of things with Barney and Dr. Kleiner that are interesting to me, and also Alex's father. I forget his first name. But I mean, the thing about them is that they're actually condensed from multiple characters. Those models you ran across several times. They were
Barney died multiple times.
Exactly. There were multiple Barneys. There were multiple Dr. Kleiner models. There were multiple black scientist models. These were characters you ran into multiple times. In fact, at the end of the game, and maybe that's who it's supposed to be, at the end of the game, before you go into the portal, maybe that's supposed to be the canon Barney and the canon Dr. Kleiner.
They're held up, right?
They're the ones that make it, and they're the only ones that aren't going to die, presumably.
Yeah.
So I guess that's supposed to be
the ones that almost fire on you, right?
Exactly right. They come around and open the door. Oh, it's Gordon Friedman, and come around and open the door. But each of these people are introduced, and you get a good look at their face really clearly, and you immediately get this like, oh, it's that guy. Barney introduces himself by name, and I think that's kind of necessary because he's a little bit more generic. It's harder to map that, but when Dr. Kleiner comes up with his glasses and his big bald head, you immediately go, oh my god, it's that guy from the first game. And that carries through a little bit to Alex's father, a little less so, I think, because I don't. His hair is grayed and so he's a little less clear. But I do remember just like at each point, each face being like, wow. I mean, and they are really kind of throwing it at you like, man, these faces are amazing. And for 2004, they certainly were. So
yeah, and I think that that moment also, I think, starts to represent as you progress further past the Barney and Dr. Klein over the video or whatever. They start pulling out nostalgic tropes, but in different contexts from then on, right? So you finally get to the lab room, and there's teleportation stuff going on, and
right.
We should not skip over Alex. They have a funny, I think, well written and well done moment with their first head crab that ends up being domesticated in Lamar.
Lamar, yes.
And just hilarious. And it's like you've been trained, especially because we just finished playing Half-Life 1. You've been trained when you see those suckers, you have this emotional reaction. And so when you see him for the first time, you're like, oh my God, it's one of those, and then they totally flip it on you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, they flip it on you.
Well, yeah, and at first it's attacking Barney.
Yeah, right.
So it's a great moment.
Yeah, making light of it. So really well done. But then, and then of course the teleportation goes awry, and they have the flash teleports that happen just like in the first one, but it's a different context, and you're seeing different things. You're not going from world to world, but you do see Breen in his office, and like all these crazy foreshadowing moments just like before, but just done differently, and the resistance is all, underground. And so this teleportation thing is not an official, officially sanctioned experiment. And then of course everything goes wrong and you get separated, and then you're kind of just like before, except now you're going through City 17 like on a macro scale. So it's just ups the ante just really nicely. But we should talk about Alex. I mean,
yes, she's the other character who you get in that like peering right into your face kind of way, like the G-Man.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what I really love about that moment is it's almost a double reversal story-wise. I've run into a place, I still don't have a weapon, and there are 6 goons here, something like that. The 6 of the Combines.
Combines, they surround you, yeah.
And, it's a moment of panic of, I don't know what to do. And they zap you or something, you fall down. And then it cuts away and you just hear combat, melee combat sounds. So Alex is presented as this super badass because she basically comes in and wipes out 6 Combine without a gun.
Yeah. And then,
which is something you won't do the whole game.
Yeah. Well, and I believe she has some badassery later too, right? And when she's, some of the levels where she's a companion and she's climbing all over the place and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and which we had forgotten, or I had forgotten from the first one, you get knocked out in the first one too. And you kind of go to, quote unquote, the trash heap or whatever. But in this case, that's kind of a repeated moment as well, but she saves you. So really great. I don't know, probably overstating it, but one of the most memorable and great character introductions. And then she especially for the time, a fully realized character. Like if not to be too declarative about it, but if the first game really was about fully realized space in Black Mesa and the quote unquote character of a place, and just a completely cohesively created world, I feel like Half-Life 2, it's one of its biggest things was character, right? Like being one of the first ones to really, still plenty of Uncanny Valley going on, but they really succeeded for their time in a lot of areas in character, both in face, both in writing, voice acting, character design, introduction design, like all of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the AI is actually quite good. I mean, the scenes can't really break the scenes, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
You have this scene where all these characters are together, the Kleiner, Alex, and Barney, and of course Lamar. And it's very difficult to break that scene. Like, you try to push the characters around, they push back, right? You can't interpenetrate or anything like that. So they'll kind of nudge you out of the way as well. It's not high fidelity, but the fact that it's fairly bulletproof and it's not like 10 seconds of bulletproof. It's like a couple minutes, a few minutes really of scene where you can go and interfere with them in all sorts of ways. There's also a lot of humor in that as well. It's got that kind of campy, goofy Half-Life humor of, that I think is more prominent in the second game, because there's less like terror and more like, oh, we're back to have fun, with this stuff again. And for example, Barney just keeps giving you a hard time about plugging the thing into the wall and throwing the switch. And oh boy, does MIT, does that MIT PhD paying off for you, or whatever it is that he says? They're kind of picking on you. And there's a running gag about a cat that was part of a prior experiment. And I mean, there's just a lot of really terrific light touch humor that also gets across a lot of story at the same time. Barney maybe feels a little like, he didn't get enough respect for being kind of a hero from the first game. And Dr. Kleiner is totally scatterbrained and is, like any scientist, willing to do things without really thinking through the consequences. For example, having a head crab that he's taken the beak out of. Oh my God. And then
which ends up being, isn't Lamar the reason that the teleporter
it all goes haywire?
Breaks?
Yes. So it's exactly, it's the unintended consequences that the scientists always have. And then, you get this running gag about a cat. So it's like, oh, it's clear that, they've been doing these experiments and trying to perfect this thing. And they don't just say, we've been trying to do these experiments. There's just this kind of, well, what happened with the cat? Or you remember what happened with the cat? And they use the humor, but also as a, so that it kind of disguises the fact that they're actually giving you exposition, in a way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, humor, coming from my theater days that I mention occasionally, humor kind of means humanity, right? Like that's why Shakespeare always had humor in all of the dramas and tragedies and stuff. And it's like that, just not taking yourself too seriously is, I think, an important part for selling these characters, and also just lightening this oppressive mood as well. It's just memorable, right? I mean, we remember them still, and there aren't very many characters in the game canon that, stand out immediately from those introductions. I mean, shifting, can I shift gears a little bit on a couple things? Because we're not going to do a full episode on this, but I did want to mention a couple extra things for this section. One, the material kind of logic of the world was also, I think, another interesting, others were doing it, but as far as immersion goes with wood and fire and combinations of things, right? Like really, and physics, as you mentioned, right? Kind of all those systems all working together was something we really hadn't seen much of before. With just the red barrels specifically, right? Where you fire on them and they will light on fire if you don't, destroy them with bullets, and then they will burn over time, and then eventually blow up. But it does give you a window of opportunity to experiment with them, right? Like lighting one on fire. And then, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's based on material rules of the real world. So, you're able to, you don't need to teach them those rules. You know what I mean? You just know that wood and fire and all that kind of stuff. Interesting.
Yes, I mean, you have a section where you have to raise the water level, right? Buoyancy was exactly where I was going.
That was
I mean, there's so much of that was surprising at this time to have. Wow, they really have, like, there's a mass puzzle, where you have to put a bunch of bricks on a board or whatever, so you can lift the other end, and they're just kind of teaching you, oh no, our physics also does this, and our physics also does this, and they just kind of take you through those things and introduce you to how much you'll be able to do, so that that there might be other ways around. The buoyancy puzzle is the one that slowed me down the most, playing it again, and I remember that the first time, and it was driving me crazy. I'm like, do I have to go back to the other room? Where do I go?
Yeah.
That one's a little...
That was a hard one.
A little sketchy.
Yeah. We, a little anecdote, like we discussed these puzzles quite heavily in early Tomb Raider development, because we wanted, obviously, the materiality of all of many of the puzzly kind of notions on the island, to be buoyancy based and physics based and material based, and Half-Life 2 was definitely one of the inspirations for that stuff, and they were doing it years earlier, so. And then the other thing I was going to mention really quick that I actually was surprised by, and I think it kind of gets better over the course of the game later in different levels, like maybe Ravenholm being an example, maybe. But one kind of bit of criticism, I guess I'd have replaying this compared to just having finished the first one, is it's very linear, and the concept of connected world, connected levels, looping back on itself and showing you the goal and then kind of looping back around to that goal. They don't do it in this first couple hours as much as they did in the first game at all. It's very much forward driven. There's a little bit, but I feel like the first game kind of did a better job of it, in really kind of making the spaces feel more fully connected than just kind of intestinal, where they're just pushing you through where they want you to go. So it might be just a product of the opening of the game needs to be more handholdy, as Dario kind of talked a little bit about, kind of crafting those moments. But I guess I was a little disappointed that it wasn't as prominent, for me at least.
Right, you do see flashes of it. I was thinking in particular of there's near the beginning, I guess when you're first going into the canals, there's a space off to your left and you kind of come around to the right, and then you have to climb up and get onto the boards, and you end up blowing some barrels so you can cross. And so there was some there, and then the other big one was the agitator. There's like a spot where there's water and there's this spinning thing in the middle, and you have to go down and into the tunnel, and you end up going into that for quite a while and coming out on the other side of that wall.
Yeah, that's true. There's definitely
there are a couple, but they're not. I definitely agree. They're not a lot of them, and I also feel like at some points you're moving too quickly to appreciate them.
Yeah, I think.
For example, the train yard is particularly that way. Where at one point I was like, "Oh, I think I'm at this point that I saw at the beginning that I ran towards, but I couldn't get to." But at that point, I had gotten so turned around and had been feeling chased, even though I don't think at that point you can even be damaged. Maybe I don't think you have a weapon yet. So maybe you take light damage.
I think you take really light damage, yeah. But
exactly.
Yeah, I think, so you're right. There are a few moments that cross over pretty directly, and I think it's an excellent point that some of it is, oh my goodness, I don't know what they're doing up there. That at some points, because you're moving so quickly, you're not going to see him as easily. But I think maybe another way to say what I'm saying is that one of the things they did really well in the first game, I think, for the most part, is they would set up the goal pretty initially in the area that you're entering, and then that would be the central goal that you're running around and through and under and all that stuff, and then you eventually accomplish that. And I feel like the land marking, for lack of a better term, doesn't do that as much so far. You know what I mean? Where there are definitely times when things are connected, and you kind of, I was over on the other side of that window 10 minutes ago, but it wasn't the goal,
Right.
And I think they'd get better at that later in the game, but I guess I just was a little surprised by that. That's all.
I agree. I mean, I think that part of the pacing of the beginning of the game works against that, because they want you to feel pursued and they want you to feel like you want to connect with these other people, so you're that's strengthened. But I definitely agree, and I do also feel like you so frequently or more frequently have spots where you can't go back in this game than you did in Half-Life 1, especially at the beginning. So and certainly when you get to the water hazard, you're doing these jumps and there's no way back.
Yeah.
So that that part of the game is now gone, as far as you're concerned, unless you want to play again. So I definitely take your point. No argument. There's
another cool little moment that I wanted to call out that I really appreciated is the resistance member who is a Vortigaunt.
Yes, and who powers you up.
Yeah, and just the concept and there's actually a street sweeper in the very opening as well.
Yes. And I saw both of them.
Yeah, just the
one you could miss, but the second one is.
Oh, okay. I missed the first one then, but just
no. The sweeper is the one I meant. The second one is the one that's powering the TV, and you drop into that container.
Yeah, that one, he even talks to you and calls you free man and all that stuff. And just this great little legendary kind of, I don't know. It's just a nice touch to have aliens from the first one, and it obviously is, as for those who've played it, know that they play a bigger role later on too, especially I think in episode 1. Just taking the history behind a specific alien from Zen and what's going on with that thing and an enemy from before, and now it's not an enemy, and what's the whole backstory there, kind of some good intrigue.
It's pretty terrific. That's a great moment, and there's a little comedy there too, because if you drop in and you're facing the right direction, you can immediately see that the human is watching television and the Vortigaunt is powering the television. In that moment, it's terrific. Yes, if you happen to drop down and be facing it, and I did that because I couldn't remember what was next, and I wanted to make sure I was ready to shoot. I didn't want to be facing the wall, so I dropped down to the hole. I mean, that's another thing I think this does very well, is that so often you know what you want to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's very tightly directed. I mean, I think that the result is it does feel linear in comparison with the first one. But I never felt lost until I got to that room with the buoyancy puzzle where you had to go back and go through a tunnel and all of that.
And then the quick just quickly look at my notes. The reintroduction of your suit was a great moment too. Turning turning a suit into a legendary moment.
It's like the Batcave.
Hilarious, yeah. But you're a scientist,
it's funny.
That's what I love. It's like, oh my God, this just crazy, but you're just Gordon Freeman,
Well, and Alex even says to you, you don't talk much, do you?
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of poking fun at the whole
self-aware
absurdity of the premise. Yeah, self-aware is a perfect word. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It's very self-aware, and it has fun with that. So the other thing I do want to touch on for me is I love the audio surrounding the Combine.
Oh, yeah. So good.
So many things. There's the sort of spinning, slicing blades. There's those cameras that are flying around and making camera noises. And they're just kind of a nuisance, really, because they also flash a bulb in your face and you can't see for a little while. But in particular, the voice of the Combine, that sort of radio, squelchy voice, and then their dying sound, which is, I think, something we've talked about.
Yeah, the EK.
You might have mentioned it before.
The EKG sound, you mean?
Yes, exactly. That they flatline.
A very distinct choice, which I don't, to be honest, I don't know why more people don't steal that, because that's a really good idea.
It's a really terrific thing, and I don't think I've seen it anywhere else.
I forgot about it until playing.
And so there's a lot of little bit of audio touches that I just think are fantastic. The other thing that's really good audio design-wise is the sound of those exploding barrels. Because they go, and there's kind of a woomph and a deadening of all the other sound for a moment afterwards. So it's like screen shake when you take a hit in a more arcade game or something like that. It's like the audio equivalent of screen shake. Like, oh, this big thing just happened, because all the audio's gone for a brief while.
Yeah, right.
Lots of really good touches like that I thought were really fantastic audio design. I assume that would have been Kelly Bailey as well this time out, who was
and I think the music is much better in 2 as well. When you start getting chased and things are ratcheted up. Yes. When the helicopter comes in,
and it fits in better as well. It doesn't feel kind of spurious. And I mean, in the original, if you died, the music just kept playing when you reloaded. It didn't start over again.
It was maybe more of an afterthought than it should have been in the first one. But
all right. Anything else you want to touch on in this first couple hours of Half-Life 2? Or
no, I think we hit all. I'm just kind of looking through. No, I hit all my main ones.
Okay, let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and read some email.
Cool.
welcome back from the break. We have now put to bed our Half-Life 2 stuff, except for feedback that we get. We had, I believe, 5 emails this week, which is great. We're trying to keep this episode short, so I think we're only going to read 2 or 3 of them, but we will get to the others in due time, I promise. You have the first one. I think it was, am I wrong? I think it was Alexander or Alex?
Alex, yeah.
Alex, okay.
So from Alex, who wrote to us about E3. Apparently, I have a terrible memory, but I'm sure it'll come to me. Greetings, gentle developers. Thank you for answering my E3 questions. I've never gone myself, but I find the stark contrast between attending and working the event fascinating. Barring a drastic but welcome career change, my experience with E3 will be limited to living vicariously through the stories of others. The closest I'll ever get is probably the old LucasArts booth at the Marin County Fair. Oh my!
You remember that?
Goodness,
that's
yes.
So great,
Alex.
I knew you would love that.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, I worked that booth at points. Watching Rebel Assault 2 and X-Wing was enough. Enough to overwhelm my little 7-year-old brain with excitement. Basically, the same thing as E3, right?
It's a matter of scale.
Oh, gosh, that's so funny. Before I get to my topic, I'll come back to that. Before I get to my topic, I want to acknowledge how stellar your Half-Life series has been. With the breadth of ideas and innovations, it's no wonder this game sparked a creative flurry from developers for years afterwards. I could jump into any topic from here, but I've been meaning to ask about game engines for a while, and it seemed to come up more on this game than it has in the other series before. What exactly does a game engine govern, and how has that changed since you both started working with them? How much can one change during production?
Let's stop there. There's a ton of questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in there.
That first one, so I think the biggest change since I began was I believe there's less, or rather fewer homegrown engines. Each company tends to license engines more even now. That was a thing that was beginning to happen at this time with your Quakes and your Unreals. Mm-hmm. But it really has ratcheted into higher gear as time has gone on. Although it feels like it's come back around even a bit now. Sometimes there's internal tech that are engines that are used. I'm thinking like of Frostbite.
Yep.
EA. That's used through multiple studios, so you tend to hear about it because they're kind of pushing the Battlefield tech as being this crazy renderer.
Well, go ahead. Every big publisher has something now, almost. EA has Frostbite. They mandated that everyone uses it now. So, racing games to, I believe even the sports games now have moved over to it.
Dragon Age, Inquisition,
Dragon Age to
Frostbite.
Battlefront to Battlefield to Mass Effect. So to Brett's point about the cyclical nature of this, the interesting thing that I would say happened, and I feel like I lived through this various ways, is that the initial excitement over id and Unreal tech and the licensing of that, as people may remember, Mass Effect started in Unreal itself. Was great because it solved a lot of problems, but I think what publishers ended up needing to think about is the dependency. Because once you hitch your wagon to an external engine, which is great because you get support from that company, and it's they're footing the bill on the maintenance of that engine, and engines are very expensive, but you're now beholden to that company, right? And so Frostbite was an initiative for EA to really just be the master of their own destiny. And I know that internally it was hard for people to kind of, we have to use Frostbite. But overall, I guess from an outsider's perspective, I'd say it's paying off for them because they now have committed, to that company-wide. And because every game is working on it, they're amortizing that over the course of it. So to Brett's point, and then of course Ubisoft has their Snowdrop engine and everyone uses that. Right,
as well as a 2D engine, which does Rayman Legends and
that's
War
of
Mine
as well, right?
I don't recall the name, but
it's
it
like
does.
It's the Magic Engine or something. It's a Michel Ancel Feels like a Michel Ancel name. But anyway, yeah, so to Brett's point, I think, and Activision's the only kind of weird one, is that they don't really have the Call of Duty stuff does, but I don't think they use that engine for everything.
It's called the UbiArt framework.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, so not as flashy as I thought. Yeah, so it's come back around. And then the interesting thing with Unreal specifically is that if you think about it, other than Gears and a few others, I think Sea of Thieves is using it, and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is using it. But as far as like big AAA games, there aren't a lot of Unreal games anymore that are publisher based.
Yes, it's more giving a leg up to indies.
Yeah.
As far as how much one can change during production, I mean, to a certain extent, and this kind of, it touches on the what does a game engine govern. For me, it's both the core functionality that it provides, which is often things like an art pipeline, access to various system resources. So, I mean, being able to read stuff from disk and stream audio and what have you, features like that are kind of shared through all types of games that you would make. But the biggest and most important thing, I think, is how easy it is to modify that engine to fit your needs. We're adding features or fixing features or, dealing with features in different ways throughout development. So in a sense, they change constantly. Republic Commando, every game changes it substantially. I mean, Republic Commando, we replaced the pathing, the AI broadly. I want to say some of the animation systems, although I don't recall specifically. It feels like we did. And then just tons of things that we added both to make it easier to make our game, and then specific things that were for our game. Specific like monster spawners and things like that just didn't exist. We had to write that code. So part of what an engine is also just the ability to modify it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a misconception that people feel like if you license Unreal, you get everything you need for your needs. But it really is just a basic. I mean, it's obviously very robust these days, but it's a basic framework.
It's like getting a chassis and a moderately functioning engine.
Yeah.
And then you want to, for a car, and then you want to go and like have the right seats, and maybe you're going to, buff up this or that, and improve the airflow through the engine. I mean, you're going to do tons of things. You get it and it will run.
Yeah.
But it's not the thing you want to take to the prom. So
yeah. Well, and the other interesting thing that does wrap back around to Half-Life 2 a little bit, because we didn't really hit this in the previous segment, but Half-Life 2 also added a bunch of new visual and rendering features to their engine that really at the time were cutting edge, with like their crazy reflection stuff and a bunch of just fancy shader stuff they were doing, or maybe materials at the time. But and so you get a lot of that when you license an engine like Unreal, or obviously Frostbite has a lot of stuff like that. But the interesting challenge, and talking about Republic Commando is one example, and I've worked in Unreal since then as well, like there is this interesting challenge where you need to try to make your game not look like an Unreal game if you want it to have its own identity. And that's a challenge in and of itself, because the rendering of the engine is dictated for you, right? You have to, and almost nobody wants to go in, license Unreal, and then rewrite the rendering.
Right.
So it's like it's all
absolutely.
art tricks,
that's the last thing, right?
Art direction, and like there's a lot of nuance.
Well, and we mentioned Arkane earlier. That's an Unreal Engine game.
Well, that's a good example, yeah.
And it looks very different from any other
that's
Unreal Engine game, and they've done a lot of work to make that the case.
Was the first, were both of them Unreal? Because
I am not certain about the second one.
Because Prey, I think, was done on the id Tech.
That would make a lot of sense since they're owned by the same company.
Yeah. Yes. Bethesda has, other than Bethesda
exactly.
Studios.
That's their internal. That's the internal one used for multiple studios, because that was also used for. It was used for Wolfenstein, but also The Evil Within.
Evil Within, yeah. And a few other odds and ends, yeah.
Yep. So he continues with...
so how much can it change? How many have you worked with? And he stands out with ease or frustration, or some friendlier to designers or programmers. That's a good one. This is a whole thing, by the way. Like, he's opened this can of worms topic.
Oh yeah, there's tons. We could talk for a long time about this, but we're trying to get.
We'll cover it.
But, I believe I've worked with 4 or 5. I've worked with Unity now. That's Tacoma's in Unity. Bethesda has their own engine. there was Republic Commando, which was Unreal. The Starfighter games had engine that we wrote from scratch, and so did Full Throttle 2, which never shipped. I've consulted on some other games and things like that, but those are kind of the big ones that I've had a lot of involvement with, and so that's how many I have. I would say the ones that were friendlier to programmers were definitely the ones we wrote from scratch, or had full source for. So that's basically everything but Unity for me. Because if I can get into the source, I can do anything.
Yeah.
Source meaning the underlying code that is the engine. In Unity, you don't have direct access to the underlying C++. You script in C#, which is another programming language that kind of sits outside. So it's more like using an API or making a mod or something like that in some ways. It's more power than that, but it's similar to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about what engines are friendlier to what disciplines, because you also can't forget art in there too, because some engines are, Unreal is pretty friendly for artists specifically because of the way that it deals with assets and stuff, and it's pretty good for designers from an iteration standpoint, especially now with blueprints and stuff, because they can really prototype quickly and create things quickly. The thing that probably Brett and programmers would say is that they're not performant though. So if you deal with so that you often end up having to take a prototype that a designer was actually able to really do very quickly and iteratively, which ultimately makes better quality, but it means you kind of have to rewrite that for native C++ code to actually make it work at performance.
Right. That's typical. That's pretty typical. I was going to say that was true of, I think it was Mysteries of the Sith that Chris Cly wrote camera code for. And it was like 3 pages of script code, and a programmer came and looked at it and kind of flipped through it and said, "Oh, okay, I see it," and rewrote it as like 6 lines of C.
Yeah,
and so there's also the sort of the expertise as well. So a good engine should allow a lot of experimentation, because that's where you get the fun from. With Starfighter, we tried to make very modular pieces that maybe took a lot of work to generate a lot of them. But that you had a fair amount of ability to control how they connected up, and they were fairly individually simple. So there wasn't scripting per se. There were just these objects you created and filled out and scheduled and things like that. Whereas Unreal has kind of a mix, because there's Unreal Script, at least there was for Republic Commando, but that's not great for programmers because of how it interacts with the engine. You have to compile in this weird way, and it kind of slows you down. There's all kinds of pros and cons with these things.
Yeah, that's really the thing, and leading up to his next question. Oh, and as far as what I've worked with, other than Unreal twice, sort of 2.5 times, I've only worked in extremely proprietary engines,
right?
That were generally pretty internal only and pretty crazy and doing a specific thing. So it was like with the Leia engine that for Jedi Knight stuff and indie stuff, and then the Starfighter stuff, and then the Crystal engine was specifically for Tomb Raider, and Halo is very is old Bungie tech that we have completely rewritten a bunch of and have kind of morphed into our own thing by now. So yeah, if you're working in those engines, it's even more challenging because they don't really transfer your skills from company to company, right? Because it's very proprietary.
Yeah, exactly. Which is one reason why engines are also popular, because people who learn skills, they're popular for creators because those people can take those skills and bring them elsewhere. They're less popular with companies because now their people could leave.
Yeah.
So there's lots of issues that go.
As far as in his next question in pre-production, who decides which engine to use? There's no one way to answer that. It really depends so heavily on the project.
What are you doing?
What the needs are,
and what's your budget?
Yeah, budget.
I remember back in the day, Unreal was like 500, 600K or something like that to license, which was a lot considering the size of the market at the time, and maybe even a percentage. I don't recall.
I think it depended on your deal, yeah.
Yeah, I think. You were basically making. I don't think it cost us that much, but
yeah. So then, how hard is it to change mid production or to remaster an old game into a new engine? Pretty hard.
More or less possible.
Yeah, it depends on where you are.
I've ever seen pull it off was Duke Nuke'em Forever, and we know how that turned out.
Yeah, great example.
Didn't they go from
probably
Quake
a few different times?
At least, yeah. and that just, it's really, really difficult to do that. And remastering an old game into a new engine is basically rewriting the game. You might, if your programmers were really good, there's probably some stuff that you can pull out and reuse. But for the most part, it's very tied together, especially to make it high performance. So it's basically starting from scratch. Usually remasters happen by taking the original source and pulling out one specific part and making that better. Usually the renderer, right? If you're taking a PS3 engine, like for the Uncharted series had a remaster, and Ratchet and Clanks went from PS2 to PS3. So lots of games like that have been remastered. Typically, what you're doing is taking out big pieces like the renderer and using the fact that the machines are much faster to take care of keeping up with the performance, because it was written for a totally different architecture and may not just go over. And then you're making that renderer able to handle more stuff, higher resolution or what have you, higher resolution models or textures. So. All right, and then there's one more question here. Having both worked on...
having both worked on sequels, how much of the game's previous code is... how much of the previous code is used in the next iteration?
A fair amount.
Yeah.
As much as you can. I mean, it depends on the timeline and the budget. With Bethesda games, they change a fair amount if you're going from Fallout to, Skyrim. But there's a lot that's similar.
I mean, to be honest,
we replaced a lot going between Fallout 3 and Skyrim.
Oh yeah, I bet. Yeah, I mean, I to be honest, I feel like strategically, one of the reasons that sequels are often a good idea, other than sort of the creative reasons and the concept of of amortizing the costs and the marketing side of it, of a sequel is a name that's known, so you want to do more of them. But leveraging stuff you've done before in the engine is just a more effective and efficient way to create new stuff. You know what I mean? It's the spaces.
Starfighter took us 2.5 or 3 years, and Jedi Starfighter took us a year.
Exactly.
Not even.
So you kind of do it intentionally.
And we added a lot of stuff, but yes, you definitely want to do it.
The challenge with that, though, is how much because you want a sequel and you want to be efficient and you want to leverage that stuff, but also you need freshness, Creatively, the challenge is engines for sequels often dictate, or you have to pick your battles at least, but they do dictate a lot of your creative decisions because the engine has already been designed to do certain things, right? So. One
of the things we talked about for Jedi Starfighter was to do that sort of role playing with the character, having light role playing elements with the character and being able to power up in different directions. That was early design stuff.
Yeah.
And we decided, okay, but this has to be done by this date. It has to be done in the next fiscal year or whatever the decision was. And that made it basically impossible to deviate very far at all. And mostly we deviated through one feature in the force powers, maybe a half feature again with large capital ships, which was something we didn't do very well in the first one. And then design, just purely level design, going in different and wacky directions. So
yeah, good topic. So he finishes by saying, geez. Obviously, brevity is not a strength of mine. Any questions you can answer will be met with empathetic nodding, while I say things like interesting or cool, didn't know that, to no one in particular. I can't wait for you guys to play GoldenEye when Brett heads to Seattle. That's a good idea. I don't know how we would play GoldenEye.
I don't know how we would play GoldenEye. I don't have a machine that could
I don't have an N64 anymore. That's a good question.
We'll have to think about that.
Is it? Oh, it's not in the rare replay, is it? No. Anyway, cool. So thank you, Alex. Great topic. Definitely could talk a lot about that one.
Okay, I'm looking for the next one I was going to read. Is this the one? Yes. Okay, I think we'll just read the 2 this time, although we did have 5. It's getting late, and I've been putting in the hours, folks. This is from Dan Hunter. He says, Hi guys, just wanted to drop you a line from Guernsey in the sunny Channel Islands. You know Guernsey? You've heard of Guernsey?
I've heard of the Channel Islands.
The Guernsey is there's the Guernsey cow. Maybe you've heard of. Spectacular dairy and a really rich milk, kind of a very creamy butter that they make from Guernsey cows.
Are you joshing me right now?
I am totally not. Guernseys are a thing.
I was like, this is one of your long games.
And the other Channel Island, the other big Channel Island is the Jersey cow, I believe, as well. It's well known. The Channel Islands for their
word for it.
Different dairy. Anyway, I came across your podcast whilst researching class materials for a new games development course I'm delivering at Guernsey College of Further Education. What sets you apart from the chaff of the internet is your industry background, that you focus on the design of classic games and the lessons we can learn from these classics. Since listening to your podcast, I've purchased myself a new entry-level Black Widow flight stick and revisiting my youth playing through TIE Fighter. Yes, well, I have one sitting on my desk too now. I'm in the process of digging out my Half-Life CD to revisit Black Mesa. I've managed to track down a physical copy of Star Wars Starfighter. Oh, good for you, Dan. Thank you. Your show now keeps me company on long marathon training runs. Your podcast is now on my required reading list for my students. So please keep up the great work. I know, nice. I never thought I'd be coursework.
Geez, wow.
Big shout out to your class at
Hi, students.
GCFE. Hello, students. He says, your interviews and experiences surrounding QA have been particularly enlightening. Could you please discuss your experiences with the documentation side of games development, as it's one area my students seem to be fairly lax about. They prefer not to have any documentation at the beginning of projects and leave this to the last moment, and it shows. And then he has one last remark, which you'll find amusing, and which will explain some of my awkwardness at the beginning of the first segment. He says, as a teacher, I set SMART targets. SMART is all capitalized. It's like specific,
science,
measurable, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and on a time scale or on a with a time limit.
Wow, that was right. You got a memory.
It's something like that. It's a type of goal setting for managers. Anyway, he says, as a teacher, I set SMART targets, so I'm going to be cheeky and set one for the show. Can you count how many times an episode either of you use the filler phrase, and try and reduce that number? It's my only gripe regarding such an informative and entertaining podcast. Best regards, Dan. Dan, that is indeed a little cheeky. And at the beginning of the podcast, I had this in mind, and I was doing my darndest. I think I ended up under 10, but I'll come in with an official count next week for both me and for Tim.
Yes, not knowing about this mail, I'm sure
you're way higher. Yeah. So it's a thing we do. I don't know if I pick it up from Tim or if he picks it up from me, but we both do it a ton. And
I'm sure we're terrible.
Never noticed it before, but I'll count it in production tomorrow. Anyway, the question was about documentation. And I think for the most part, we can both answer this to a different degree, but I think a lot of it is about design documentation more than it is technical documentation.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Well,
it's been an evolving thing.
Yeah, there's long stories here too. There's a lot we can talk about. It's interesting. He mentioned QA in the same breath as documentation, so I kind of am interested to know what he means by that, because documentation for QA is a whole different topic. But documentation for game development, if you talk about design first, though everybody kind of has some specking that they would do, even dev specking and stuff, or programming specs. But for design, as Brett knows, and he kind of already alluded to, I've really ebbed and flowed on this topic. I was trained up in the old LucasArts days, coming from the sort of what I guess I might say biblical strategy of writing Bible-centric, design documentation, or GDDs, game design docs that were, tomes of information. Basically, before much of the production would start, would be written down and really document from top to bottom the whole project, from a project director or something like that, or lead designer, and that would dictate sort of a lot of things. And so I think that was really met with mixed results, to be honest. And I think from then, ebbing and flowing, like I said, to medium versions of that, to briefs where we would have maybe like a 20-page document that was more kind of like the high-level framework and vision behind the game. And that was still at a time when games were small enough and teams were small enough where I think that was effective. And then I've gone all the way to the degree where we would be working in full agile mode, and your only documentation was really user stories and databases, and you were working sprint by sprint on goals, and then trying to prove out the concepts that you have. And the documentation was very light. And I guess I feel like these days maybe we're a little somewhere in the middle, where I think some documentation is critical. I work at such a scale now where there's no way one design doc would do it. But the thing that I've actually, I feel like I should work with the team more on this in my day job. I should do this more. But I think the place where I've kind of landed with documentation, to be honest, because it can be a very valuable tool as a communication tool to the rest of the team to get into someone's head about what a spec really is from a design spec specifically and what it needs to be. And it does help, but conversations face-to-face tend to be more valuable, I think. And so you still want them to spec, but then you want to have that follow-up conversation. But to be honest, what I think is most valuable these days is for the person writing it. What it does do, students, what is his name again? Sorry, I'm forgetting. Dan. For Dan's students. Professor Dan, listen up. You do need to do your documentation, if only for your own sake. To just take a moment, sit down, think about what the heck you think is the right answer, and organize your thoughts. It doesn't have to be long. Like, we deal with a lot of one-sheets, and like really minimalistic stuff, but at least it forces you in a framework to really sit down and think about it rather than just shoot from the hip. Once you get into working, you're going to shoot from the hip, right? Especially if you're working in sprints or something. Like, you want to be iterative. You don't want to stick to the letter of the law with the document, but the document does at least give you a good kind of jumping off point, to actually put your thoughts and organize your thoughts, because you are going to, designers guide a lot of the team on what is going to be happening. And if you don't have your stuff together, it's going to really show, as Dan mentioned. And so, don't overwrite it, don't overthink it, but, give yourself some discipline and some rigor with it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. At the beginning of my career, one of the things of documentation I did think was valuable that we did on the Starfighter games is that we documented functionality that we provided pretty heavily.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother tech docs. Yeah.
Right. So we would write technical documentation for like this feature, like how the shield system works and what the numbers mean and how you can tune them, and basically just tell designers everything that they needed to know. Like, literally, this is the variable name and it does exactly this. And we had page upon page. We used some early Microsoft, HTML writer to write a big web page of all this stuff. And we kept it all linked together. And it was really helpful when we gave when we had new designers come on for Jedi Starfighter, because anything they needed to know was just there. And at one point we even compiled it into a compiled help file, which runs inside your app and just pops up Windows style help. I think Troy actually spent a lot of time doing that. But one of the things at LucasArts that I think was a little overthought was they did these big programming technical designs, and they had 10 major categories of questions, and in it, they might have another 20 or 30 questions depending on the thing. And although some of that I thought was valuable for people in particular who are doing multiplayer, it was really good to know what their networking solution was going to be and how they were going to be peer-to-peer or server terminal or whatever. And so there are things like that were good questions to ask. But honestly, I think the amount of time that went into writing those to then basically not be read by all the programmers who were in theory reviewing them was a huge amount of wasted effort. Yeah. And these days, I'm working on a very small team now. Our technical design tends to be more just talking like you were saying, talking about how a thing will work. And since I'm fairly senior to the person I'm working with, often that's me explaining the sorts of problems that the going this way solves. So I could write all of that down, but it's better to sort of give a specific example. One that I just was talking about recently with her was using a number to determine whether a thing is hidden versus a flag, just true or false value. And the reason why you do that is that multiple things want to hide an object. Like in a game, in Starfighter, for example, your cutscene engine wants to hide objects so that they're not on screen when the cutscene is playing. But also you want to hide things because they're not in part of gameplay yet. And you want to hide things for this, that, and the other. And you have like a handful of things that might want to hide an object. And then those systems each individually want to say, okay, I'm done hiding this object, and I want to unhide it now.
You need to know which...
And now you don't know what, should it really be unhidden? So you count, like, how many things have asked for this to be hidden, and then you, as people unhide it, you just bump that number down. And you can get more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. And that's way more important than me writing down a design document for how we're going to hide a thing. Because it gives a specific story of this is the problem, the sorts of problems that it solves, and we'll do that's why we're choosing it to do it this way.
Yeah.
If I were in a larger team, I'd probably be trying to set technical decision, making, but we don't do a lot of that. Some of the companies I worked at more lately were just very heavily producer based and just had a lot of producers, and they had a lot of documentation that made sense to them. And they made sure everybody who needed to talk to one another talked to one another.
They were the kind of living...
They were living documents.
Yeah,
and I expect that there isn't a huge number of producers in Dan's class. So you can't really rely on that.
I think, to summarize some of my previous points on that, too, it just, like... I'm sure some of the frustration that maybe the students feel or that I felt in the past, especially with really, really big GDDs, is as soon as you write them, they're out of date. Because one of the things that I think the growing pains the industry has gone through early days was understood because the teams were so small and the engines were different and the games were so small, and so iteration was just a natural thing. But then we kind of got into this weird middle ground where we were too big, iteration was slow. So we felt like we needed to write it all down and make sure everyone understood what it was, and then we just kind of execute it and as the document says, but then kind of lost the iteration and realized that's not actually how you make a game. You can't write it all down and then make it because it just doesn't work that way. So you need to actually iterate, you need to play test, you need to
because
change
it goes off the rails the first time you encounter something that's not fun the way it's written.
Because a document's not a game, and so I'm sure that's where the students are coming from. However, I just want to reiterate my point that think about how the document helps you as a writer, right? Like, it's going to help other people who read it, of course, especially if it's just a few pages or whatever, but it also just helps. Like, don't make it into like, oh, I need to do this for these other people so they know what's going on. That's important from a direction and vision perspective, but also it's just good, for designers on the game I'm working on now. Like, it's good for them to just sit down, and if they're going to actually, direct somebody with a design spec, and we're not to get down to brass tacks, but we're spending a lot of money on whatever that feature is, the person better have thought things through a little bit,
Right. So. Yeah. And I've seen really good techniques for that, for organizing stuff more visually. If you have visual people, Stone LeBrand did one-page game designs where features of, I believe, mostly SimCity were diagrammed out on just pieces of paper.
Totally.
But in some cases, big pieces of paper. Yeah, images and flowcharts and things like that.
Visio is your friend, like a
super helpful.
I think for Dan, I hope you accept Visio flows and as a document. I think we use a lot of PowerPoint because it keeps keeps it brief, but it's presentable, and you can just quickly go through it. So it kind of forces. So anyway,
and sometimes as a programmer, and this is kind of my last point, I guess, is that sometimes you didn't know all the requirements of a system going into it, and they weren't discoverable by you at that point. So you kind of built up a thing that is working, and you get to a point, though, where it just becomes too complicated to maintain, And that's a good point to go back and say, okay, now that I know all the things that this thing has to do, now let me actually design a solution for that instead of up front for the thing I didn't know that I was going to build. So, I just had to do this recently, so it's in the front of my mind where I actually had to go down and say, okay, I know everything that this is supposed to do now. Let me just literally draw a flow chart, a state machine of how this bit of code is going to work. And I'm going to re-implement that code probably tomorrow. So, so it's very, very, very fresh in my mind. But it's that's the kind of level of design document I'm most comfortable with these days. It's easy to read, communicates everything it needs to, and having a huge pile of them wouldn't help anybody. So,
all that being said, to talk out of the other side of my mouth and to support the students a little bit, like I do also have the mantra with most teams I've been on for quite a while is that on screen is king. So you want that documentation as some framework, and to have some of the discussion before you spend a lot of money prototyping or effort prototyping. But, ultimately playing the game is the real truth. So, yeah. Good topic.
Another good topic.
Didn't expect that one.
Yeah, I know. I threw a couple zingers at you. I
feel a lot more pressure on this podcast if students are actually listening to it.
Oh my goodness! Plus, we have to count how often we say,
Yeah.
So I think we're gonna punt on the three other emails this time because we're already longer than we expected. So let's talk about next time.
Yeah, so
next series.
We haven't hit this genre yet. We always try to find some relevant, events happening in the industry, in the landscape to trigger a game that we want to play. And I think because I don't know, we were talking about the Super Nintendo Classic Edition coming out, like the NES had, and the suite of games on that thing. So it's, it's an awesome little package, and Nintendo's really killing on those things, even though they're hard to get. And so, platformers that's a genre that we have not played yet. And of course, arguable, but one of the best ones is Super Mario World, as they say. And as a 2D platformer, I felt like the right one to start with in the way we played Super Metroid and Link to the Past, which are two games on that same system. So felt like of the main three franchises of Nintendo, we still haven't played a Mario game. So I'm sure we'll do
and arguably it casts the longest shadow. I think he's been in the most games, right? I mean, he's been in 30-something or 40-something games.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as far as...
Granted, a lot of them aren't platformers, but because of characters. So.
Yeah, he's evergreen, all kinds of different genres. But as far as 2D platformers go, it seems like a great one to start with. I know it's beloved by a lot of people. The irony, which I think I mentioned on the Super Metroid and Link to the Past podcast, is I'm not necessarily a big Mario fan myself, and I'm not a platformer fan.
I remember when Alex Noisy sent out an email to the whole company saying, Tim Longo has never finished a Mario game?
And then he proceeded, we played Super Mario Brothers many years ago together and passed the controller, and he forced me to finish it, which I did enjoy, but it's just, I'm not good at them. I think that's my main challenge. Yeah. But it'll be fun to go through this one. I've only started this one a few times, but never finished it. So it'll be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I haven't played tons of the 2D Mario games. I did play the original Super Mario Brothers. I, of course, played Donkey Kong and the Super Mario that was in the arcades. And I think that might be it. I played a little bit of a Super Mario 3. In 2D, but after that, for me, it's been all 3D platformers for Mario.
Yeah, so and as you mentioned,
Mario 64, and I played Sunshine, and I got all 151 stars in Super Mario Galaxy, which is probably my biggest gaming feat in my history, because getting some of those with Luigi was pretty insane.
That sounds crazy.
You can play through a second time as Luigi. It's madness. It was totally crazy. That's a month of my life I won't have back.
I don't know how you do it. Yeah, I mean, and as you mentioned, like when Super Mario Odyssey comes out, maybe we'll play a 3D Mario game at that point or something. But 2D's up next. Super Nintendo's on everyone's tip of their tongue right now, and even though it's not out yet, and going to the classic That'll be next. So we're going to play.
We're going to play the Yoshi's Island. Yeah, World 1. I don't recall how any of the saving on this thing goes. I think you'll be in best shape because, once again, you're playing on the 3DS and you can basically save the whole state. I'm going to be playing on the Wii as I did.
And they don't have that feature on that, huh?
Link? No, they didn't for Link to the Past or Super Metroid. So we'll see what happens with me. Whether I have to start fresh every time I play, that'll be interesting. I'll be really good at those first levels. But yeah, we'll play Yoshi's Island, which is the first world, and then there's a boss that you have to defeat in order to be able to go on to the second world. So
the first world is called Yoshi's Island. Isn't that also a separate game?
Yes, I believe it is.
Super Mario World 3, 2, 3. Anyway, yeah. We're going to have to talk about this because
we're going to have to. I am not good on the lore and how all these things connect.
People are probably yelling at us right now.
We'll have to do some history. Yeah, we're not researching the history now. We haven't even started playing.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
But yeah, we'll keep it small. I think there is a minimal path. I think you don't have to do every level, and so there's a lot of interesting structural stuff about it. In a lot of the Mario games, there are actually interesting platforming structures, and that's worth discussing. I'm not sure how many of them go this far back, but it's certainly worth looking at. So yeah, we're gonna play that, and like I said, I'll be playing on the Wii. He's playing on the 3DS. I think it's also available for the Wii U, and for those of you who are fine with an emulator, we're not going to say we encourage it, but if you want to play along, it's the only way. It will work. So
yeah, and just to be specific, if you're going to play on the 3DS, it's only the new 3DS, we believe, just like Super Metroid.
That is correct. Right.
Those tricky.
Yes, those people.
Mm-hmm. Not happy.
Okay. But, you can reach us by email, and of course, as we mentioned, we'd love to have your email. That is devgameclub@gmail.com, and of course, you can follow us on Twitter at devgameclub. We have had a bit of a hiatus from reading the reviews because we've had such jam-packed episodes recently that we haven't been able to get to them, but we will get back to them, and we love to have them. It helps us reach new listeners, as well as your word of mouth. Tell a friend if you love it, or share it on Twitter, or what have you. I am on Twitter as @Brett_Duville, and he is
@TimLonga Jr. with the JR at the end.
And we'll see you all next week on Yoshi's Island. Good night.
Good night.